totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and follow on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. Legendary music manager, record producer, songwriter, and author Simon Napier-Bell is our guest. Simon has been a leading figure in the music industry for over 40 years. He's managed the Yardbirds, Marc Bolan, Boney M, Asia, Ultravox, Japan, and Wham. He's also written film scores and co-wrote Dusty Springfield's hit You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, later recorded by Elvis Presley. In the 80s, he masterminded taking Wham to China, the first Western pop group ever to play there. And during the last 2 decades, he's written 4 best-selling books on the music industry. Simon is on the show to talk about 3 brand new books that are coming out here in the States. I'm Coming to Take You to Lunch, a fantastic tale of boys, booze, and how Wham were sold to China. Black Vinyl White Powder, the real story of the British music industry. And The Business, a history of popular music from sheet music to streaming. He also put out a book in late 2022 called Sour Mouth, Sweet Bottom, Lessons from a Dissolute Life. We cover a lot of ground in this episode. Simon opens up about the late great Jeff Beck, when Jimmy Page ended up joining the Yardbirds, and how that led to the demise of the band, plus his amazing account of the days when the Mafia were running the rock and roll business. All that coming up with our guest, Simon Napier-Bell. Simon, welcome to the podcast. Great to meet you.
Happy to meet you too.
We've got 3 books that are about to come out here in the States that I want to ask you about, but let's start first with the 2022 book, Sour Mouth, Sweet Bottom. Can you talk about what this book is about and how you got it started?
That's the first book I set out to write without thinking I'm writing about the music business. Of course, there's lots of music business in it because it's what I've done with my life. But that's really a book about me. In fact, the way I described it at the beginning is I picked up my snapshot album and I shook it, and these are the ones which fell on the floor. It's just little vignettes, 50 vignettes. It could have been 50 different ones. You know, it's when I started to write it, I thought this could go on. I could write 5 books like this. But it was fun and quicker than normal because there was no research. The research is just looking into my head.
I want to start by asking you about an interesting quote in the beginning of this book. You write, I had no long-term objectives and there was nothing I really wanted. To work just to make money felt like a waste of my life. But when I passed time aimlessly, listening to music, eating with friends, getting drunk, having sex, just thinking, it felt like time well spent. How to reconcile those 2 things was my principal conundrum. And you were able to reconcile that conundrum by becoming a music manager.
I'm not sure I've ever reconciled them, but the point is music artists have ambition. They know what they want. They want to get there. And they ask me, how do I do it? And I find it quite easy to give them advice. And so I still don't have any motivation or know where I want to go, but they say, how do I do that? I say, well, I want to be a star singer. I said, have you had singing lessons? No, that's brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, you're a great manager. This is quite an easy job. So it's still not really reconciled, you know, and the things I think make life most worthwhile are not the things where you're struggling to make money. But very often having a little money helps you find time to do, like walking on the beach, drinking, having sex, all the things I described.
Where'd you grow up in the UK?
I grew up in around London. We were in a suburb called Ealing. My dad was a documentary film director, so I had a sort of an ethos of it wasn't really money making. It was he was a passionate film buff. So at the age of 7 or 8, I was being taken always to the cinema by him to see usually French or Italian films. He had the feeling these are the great films. If they didn't speak English, they must be better films. It took me a long time to come to realize Americans were pretty good films too.
There's a great chapter in the book titled 1966, Beck's Bolero, and you tell the story of how you became the Yardbirds manager, which is an absolutely fascinating chapter. Now, Jeff Beck, it's still hard to believe he's gone. What was your first impression of Jeff as a musician and as a person, from a personal standpoint?
Well, as a person, here I was out of my depth. I was 23, 24. I got introduced to the Yardbirds. I'm not a person ever to say no when I'm given a challenge. But I was offered the management of the Yardbirds. I'd never listened to rock music in my life. I'd played jazz. I was a musician. I loved jazz. And here was a rock group. It's a sort of mysterious word. What is rock music? I went home and I listened to rock records all night and tried to get the hang of it. And almost the first thing I had to do was go and produce a record with them because they needed a new single. So they agreed I was the right person to manage them. I had sort of credentials of being, a sharp kid around town. I'd done a few things. I had managed a group for duo I'd put together and got a small hit with them. And I get to the studio and I found, first of all, they hadn't written a song, and the studio's incredibly expensive, £10 an hour. But that was like, $100, $200 an hour now. That was really expensive. And you don't arrive without the song. And they said, oh, yeah, man, we thought that's how we do it. So I thought that was a bit of a strange way to make a record. And then they start playing around, and Jeff arrives late, and they sort of diss him a bit. We don't need you, Jeff, yet. And he said, well, that's great. And I'll piss off. And he obviously didn't get on with them that well. And so the others got on with writing the song, and they went to the studio and they played. After a while, they said, yeah, I think that's the first verse. And I said, you haven't changed a chord. You just played 8 bars on the same damn chord. And they said, yeah, we like that. It's a good chord. I said, good chord. It's the tonic. I mean, it's the most basic chord in music. You just play 8 bars then. Yeah, well, we'll play another one with the next 8 bars. And, if it's jazz, you'd have changed the chords 17 times by now. You'd have gone through the whole thing. And so that's my first lesson in rock music. It's better if you don't change the chord. What comes next is better for not having changed the chord. There's a different tension in rock from jazz. I was learning fast. And, by the time we finished making that record, I thought I knew a bit about rock music. But Jeff came in last always to put the solo in. He wasn't standing in the studio laying down the track with them. That had happened before I arrived as their manager. Whether that was because he didn't like to be part of what they were doing, or they just felt he wasn't cooperative, I don't know. But I liked him instantly. To me, he was the stand-up musician. This is the guy who was really a musician, and he had it all in his own head, and he was living in his own mind. And so I loved everything he did on that record. But they always teased him. There was one track in the whole album where they gave him a solo. This is your big solo track, Jeff. This track's for you. And they were so sort of patronizing to him. You go in the studio, you can do it, Jeff. This will be your big solo. And he was pissed off with them. So he went into the booth with his guitar. And the bit came in the track where he had to play the solo. And he turned and faced them, all standing in the control room. And he put a big, moody, sneering face on. And he just played one note, and he didn't change it. He held that note for 3 12-bar segments. And it's genius. It's the most brilliant note you ever heard. It's there off the record. And that was his way of saying, fuck you. I'm not playing the solo you want. And that taught me a lot about rock music, because a lot of what comes out of rock music is tension between people. And if they'd all been in good terms, he'd have gone on and played a bit of a diddly solo, all rather nice and flashy, instead of which all this pent-up emotion came out in that one note. And I love that rock music needs those tensions. It needs that aggression.
Was that a sign of things to come for him? Was he just better off on his own? He had his battles with Rod Stewart in the future years, and they made some great music together.
Jeff was very much in his own mind, in his own head. He was never liked an audience either. I mean, you see him in live gigs. I mean, there's a brilliant gig that he did at Ronnie Scott's towards the end of his life. And a fantastic gig with wonderful musicians. And he'd finish a number and the audience would applaud. He'd, shut up. It's the next number. We don't want all this rubbish, He needed the audience. He really needed them to test him, to push him to play better. But he didn't really care what they thought. You watched Jeff on the stage at a big auditorium playing a solo. And it was this, if he was in a cocoon, in his own little world, almost like in an invisible cage, wound up in himself. He never played to the audience or for the audience. But then being there was important because he couldn't screw up. He knew there was a big audience there. He couldn't just fuck up and give up on the solo. So it both pressured him and annoyed him slightly. And then when they all applauded, he didn't like interrupting the music. Didn't like that.
I admired as he went through the phases of his career, he never stopped experimenting and trying different things. And I love his phase in the early 2000s, late 90s, when he incorporates electronic beats and He was always pushing forward, a true artist.
Well, one of the great things, he did it publicly in his solos, didn't he? I mean, he'd be playing a solo, and it was part emotion, part technique, and part experimenting. I mean, you often got the feeling he's never done that before. He's just tried it right now. It's almost as if he's in a room by himself. And it may or may not be true. It may have been something he'd done before, but you got the feeling he was just doing that for the first time, and you'd heard that with him the first time he discovered it. That's what drew people to him so much.
Did you keep in touch with him over the years? Did you talk to him recently?
Yeah, I did. But I mean, I didn't keep in touch. I mean, he was not an easy person to keep in touch with. And, in the music business is sort of, it's a very business, the manager's relationship is totally friendly. You can't work with people if you're not friendly. But it's like your doctor. You love your doctor. When you get ill, you almost like being ill because you like your doctor so much. But when you're not ill, you don't call him up and say, let's have dinner. It's a professional relationship. And every time I met Jeff, it was great, lovely. How are you? Have a hug and a drink. But I didn't phone up, keep in touch.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if I called him up and said, hey, I want to work with you again, can I be your manager? We'd have probably said, oh, yeah, that's good. Let's do that. It was friendly, but Jeff wasn't that friendly with anybody. He liked cars and girls, actually. The last time I met him, I said, what are you doing? So my ambition, I've realized my ambition, I'm doing 2 short tours a year. All the musicians are girls, and in between, I'd work with my cars. I've got life perfect at last.
Yeah, he had the song Grease Monkey, and the album cover, I think it's You Had It Coming, where I think it's his hands, all greasy from getting under the hood. Yeah.
Yeah.
You write in that same chapter about Jimmy Page joining the Yardbirds. You set it up by writing, quote, whether my next move was a mistake or not is a matter of whether you see it from the point of view of the Yardbirds or of rock history. It led to the demise of the group. Can you take us back to when and how Jimmy ended up joining and why that led to the demise of the Yardbirds?
I was so ignorant. I mean, I knew nothing about management. And the very first gig the Yardbirds did with me as manager was in Paris. So we all flew off to Paris to do this gig, and it went very nicely. I think it was a club called the Bilboquet in Paris, an old rock club. And we were walking back from the gig to the hotel afterwards, and I was walking with Paul Samuel Smith, who was the essence of the group, really. He was the bass player. He created the group originally, and he was always co-produced the records with their previous manager and was now doing it with me, their new manager. And he said, I hate live work. I can't stand it. It's terrible. I hate playing live. It's the worst thing. I cringe. And this was just one gig. But when we go on tour, I just can't face it. And I knew nothing about rock management. So I said, well, that's terrible. And if you don't like it, you shouldn't do it. Life's too short to do all the things you don't want to do. Why don't you leave the group? We'll find somebody else. And I meant it in a kindly, nice way. I didn't realize that if there's one overriding job a rock manager has, is to keep the group together. Come what may, keep your group together. And the tension within a group is good, it's creative. I didn't know that. And so off he went. And now we had a group without a bass player. And they all talked about who they should get. And they mentioned Jimmy Page. They knew Jimmy. And I knew Jimmy because I'd been writing songs, and I used him every time I wrote songs. I used him as a session guitarist to play the backing tracks. And I said, well, it's fine, but he may say he'll come and play bass guitar, but he won't. I promise you. He's a fantastic guitarist. He'll play bass guitar for one gig, and then he'll say, no, man, I think I'll play lead guitar. But they all said, no, he'll do it. He's great. We love Jimmy. He's good. So he came in, and it wasn't one gig. It was one song. After one song, he walked across the stage. He pushed his bass into Chris Strayer's hands. Chris was the rhythm guitarist, and took Chris's rhythm guitar. And he never played bass again.
Oh, man.
But, then we had this amazing thing. We had the 2 greatest guitarists in England in one group. And in those days, there was no mixing desks. When you heard a gig, what you heard came off the stage. So they turned up with their amplifiers, put them on stage, and you were listening to their music straight from the amplifiers on stage, which is why, as time went on, the amplifiers got bigger and bigger stacks to make them louder. There was no other way of making them louder. So Jimmy stood one side of the stage and Jeff stood the other. And they played all the solos, which were Jeff's solos, which everybody knew from the records. They played them in unison, perfectly in unison, but it gave a stereo effect, which nobody had ever heard before, because you couldn't recreate that through a desk because there weren't desks. And so the others had this extraordinary sound. And it really changed, put them on another level. But neither Jimmy or Jeff were happy, because Jeff now was sharing the applause with Jimmy, and Jimmy was playing Jeff's solos, not his own. So they were both, there was a yin yang, there was a sort of anger, and they were friends and admired each other's playing and also hated playing with each other. I mean, it was complicated, but it created, that's what makes a group. You felt that tension coming off the stage, and they were fantastic. And you can see it in the other thing I managed to do for them, which is I got them into that film Antonioni made called Blow Up, and they played together brilliantly. Absolutely, they were like one guitar. People would say, who's playing the solo, who's playing the rhythm? They have an ability to blend together quite miraculously.
How long did that partnership last? How long were they in the band together? Not long, right?
3 months, 4 months.
Wow.
They went, after they did that film, they went off on tour in America, and Jeff left halfway through the tour. When they came back to England, he rejoined them for 2 weeks or 3 weeks and walked out again, and that was it. Going back to what you said, he fell out with Rod too. I mean, he didn't really fall out. It's just that Jeff is a very self-centered, isn't the word. He was just a very individual person. He was happy by himself. He really was. If you'd found a way to get up on stage and just be him only on the stage, he'd have been happy with it. There's another thing about Jeff, which people didn't talk about very much. When he died, all these obituaries, and they all talked to him about being the greatest guitarist, or was he the greatest guitarist? But there was another thing about Jeff, that every guitarist I've ever known, if you talk about Eric Clapton or Jimmy Page or any other great guitarist, whoever they are, whatever style, they love the guitar. And if you go to their home, in their collection of guitars, there's always the beautiful Spanish guitar, which they hold like a baby in their arms, and cost it a couple of other acoustic guitars. Jeff hated acoustic guitars. He didn't even have one. If you said to Jeff, have you got an acoustic guitar? He said, yeah, man, I got this one. But it was electric acoustic. It wasn't a real acoustic guitar. He liked the electric guitar. He never learned the ordinary guitar. When he was a kid, he saw Les Paul play, and he loved the idea of the tricks and the electronic trickery you could do. And he tried to build his own electric guitar out of bits and pieces. And then eventually his mum went and bought him one. But he never played an acoustic guitar. He didn't like it. If you said, "Oh, do it on this," you're in the studio, so just show us what you want to do on that. He wouldn't do it. Wow. No, find me a proper guitar.
And his style, the way he played, it was nobody else played like him. And then
because he wasn't interested in guitar, he was interested in electric guitar.
I want to get to the new books, so I'll just ask you about one more story in Sour Mouth, Sweet Bottom, and that's about Marc Bolan, of course. A legend. Marc turned up uninvited at your flat one night in 1966, and you write, quote, "I was entranced." He played a dozen songs for you. What do you recall about that night? What was it that struck you about him? Because as we know, he went on to become a huge star, and he went on to become even more legendary after his passing.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? I mean, he never really happened in America, and yet he influenced. You can hear in Prince's early hits, you can hear so much Marc Bolan. You think, God, he must have been brought up listening to Marc Bolan. He was a little guy. I mean, very small, 5'2", and quite intense. And he thought a lot about image. He came to my flat. I'd never met him. He got my address somehow, rang the bell, said, "I'm a singer. I'm going to be a big star. I want you to be my manager." I was already managing the Yardbirds, beginning to know what I was doing. I sort of tried to get rid of him. I said, "Come to the office tomorrow." He said, "Oh, but I'm here now, man. Could I play for you?" And I thought, well, I'll intimidate him, because even people who want to be stars are very easily intimidated. I said, "Okay, play me a song. Come in, sit down, play me a song." And he chose. I had this one really, really big armchair. I'm quite a big sort of bloke, and he was tiny. And he climbed up into it the way a dog would jump up into a chair, not sitting on the chair, but getting into it. And he sat on it cross-legged. So it was like a stage, really. And he was sitting there cross-legged in this big chair. And he got out his guitar, and completely uninhibited, he started playing. And he had this strange, wavery, quivery voice, which I'd never heard anything like it. I'm not sure if I liked it or didn't like it. That wasn't really relevant. It was strange, beautifully in tune, and incredible timing. He sang all blues-based songs, and he had wonderful timing. And he could only play 2 chords, and he had a capo. And so when he had to play a chord which wasn't one of those 2 chords, he had to move the capo up and down the guitar to play the guitar. And he developed this technique where with his left hand he could unscrew the capo while he tapped on the fretboard and kept time. 1 bar only. Dut, 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 dut with his right hand. And while he was dut, dut for 1 bar, he could unscrew the capo, which was going, screw it up again and go on. It was such an incredibly clever trick. You thought, it would just be easier to learn the chords, really. I mean, that's so tricksy what he's just done. But between that and the lyrics and the songs, it was entrancing, just that. And I thought the whole world is going to fall in love with him. And we went that very night. I phoned up a studio. It was 9:00 at night. I phoned a studio, found one open, Kingsway Studio it was. And we went there at 9:00 at night. All the songs he just sung for me, I re-recorded them. And it went out as an album later called The Beginning of Doves, just a solo album. It was an amazing experience watching him do that.
Simon Napier-Bell is here to talk about his amazing career in the music business. You have, I believe, 3 new books. You can correct me if I'm wrong on the dates here, Simon. 2 due out April 4. I'm coming to take you to lunch.
They're not completely new. They're new in America. They're books
Right.
I've published. I've done 5 books altogether, and coming out here or coming out there in America because I'm not there is The Business, and that is a little bit different because there's nothing about me in that book. Usually, I write about the music business, but I sprinkle myself liberally in amongst it. But The Business is simply the history of the music industry, the business of popular music, not the music, but the business of pop music, from when that started as a business, which is when copyright started, and suddenly you could buy and sell music and own it, until today. That's coming out. And then there's a book about Wham, when I took Wham to China. And that was more of a fun book to write. I didn't have to research that very much because it's in my head from memory or a few notes. The other one's my new book, which we were just talking about.
Okay, so yeah, I'm coming
Oh,
to take
and there's there's Black Vinyl, White Powder. I'm sorry.
Black Vinyl, White Powder.
That was the history of the British music industry from the beginning of rock music until today, told from a different sort of perspective. It's not like The Business, which is very much a history of how the business shifted and changed. This is more of a personal memoir of the business from my point of view. Not about me, it's about the business, but I'm in there a lot.
I want to talk about the business now, because in this book, I'm just fascinated with these types of the number story and the streaming and the history of all this and where we're going with it and how it's changed the way we purchase music and are exposed to music. It's so different now. You take readers through the evolution of the music industry from the early 1700s to today. When and how does the music business begin? When does music become owned, as you say in the book, like property?
In 1713, they passed the Copyright Act, which made the ownership of creative copyright, intellectual copyright, a legal thing. And they added that the owner, which would be the writer, the creator, could, if they chose to, sell it. And that created the business. It was books as well as music. But it was taken to mean music. And so from that day onwards, if you'd written a song and you could persuade people they wanted to hear it or they wanted to buy the sheet music for it, you printed that sheet music, sold the sheet music, it was yours. No one else could print that song. You could take a legal action against them if they did. And so, well, it started music publishing, and music publishers bought songs from the writers. I mean, usually the writers for £5 or something would sell their song to the music publisher, who do everything they could to make it popular and then print the music and sell it. I mean, it's the same as later happened with records. The business was not really selling music; it was selling paper at inflated prices. You know, you bought a cent's worth of paper and you sold it for $20 because it had music printed on it. But that's what it was. That was the beginning of the music industry, and from then on, it was a cutthroat, sharp, competitive, compelling, and always hugely fun business. I mean, it's all those things, and it in many ways hasn't changed at all. I mean, you could say it's changed. Sheet music changed to records. Records have changed to streaming income. But the basic thing is the same. You have to have hit songs to support everything which sits on top of it. Yes, you have a multi-billion-dollar industry, but basically that's based on a flow of hit songs. If the hit songs stop, the industry collapses. And so every major corporation, there's really only 4 of them now, has to keep its flow of business and income, and you know they exist on a huge level. You know, if you've ever walked into Sony's offices in New York and you look up at this massive skyscraper and you think they've got one in Nashville, they got one in LA, and they've got one in Miami, they've got 18 of these buildings, and they employ thousands of stuff, and all this money is flowing. It's all based on hit songs, and nobody knows what makes the hit song. Every single one is luck. And so half the corporation is dedicated to finding bits of luck which will continue to give them their income. The other half is dedicated to monetizing those bits of luck when they arrive. And that's this extraordinary industry. Now, everybody who works it doesn't think about that. They're just thinking about music. We all love music. It's fun, it's competitive. But that's what the business is. It's finding luck and then monetizing it. The end thing is, if that doesn't happen, the company collapses.
When I think of pirating music, or somebody brings up pirating music, I always think of the early 2000s when Napster comes in and people began sharing MP3s. But pirating goes back to 1905, according to your book. The Pirate King. Can you talk about the Pirate King?
Well, I mean, of course it did, because, you know, you came along, you're a sharp sort of gangster type of person, and you thought, hey, this song, everybody wants to buy this song. I'll print the music. You don't have the rights to it. You just print it up, and I'll go out the street and sell it. You know, why don't go in the shop and pay 10 cents for it? Buy it here for 5 cents. You know, and so these quite organized crime syndicates did this. And that was with sheet music, and they would buy it, print it, and sell it cheap on the streets. And it was difficult to get rid of them. You had to pass laws in Parliament which allowed you to deal with them, which allowed to enforce copyright. And they were clever. They found ways to. You know, the copyright maybe didn't apply to single pieces of paper or to things which were given away, or they said, you can have this, give me a donation. And I mean, they found lots of ways, right? As people always do. That sort of pirating has gone on of some sort or other, almost since the beginning.
Music makes us feel good, and boy, you can sell feeling good very easily. That's the thing with music. I mean, it's people just, they want it so badly. They want that feeling. So you have to be careful. There are people that are going to take advantage of that.
The industry takes advantage of it. And this is the point about this industry. It is an industry which gives us something we love and can't live without. And most of the people working in the industry do it because they love music. But the industry also is a cutthroat. I mean, you know, people think it's right that the Performing Rights Society was set up in England and ASCAP and BMI in America, which means every time a record is played on the radio, the writers or the performers get some money for it. But when the first people suggested that, when it was first suggested by some people in the industry, other people said, that's shocking, that's terrible. You're taking music away from the people. This is music. We love music. Sure, you pay for the sheet music, you pay for the record, but this is just people playing the song, enjoying the song. Now you've got to make them pay for that. But of course, technically, if you walk down the street whistling a song and other people hear it, you could actually be prosecuted by ASCAP or BMI for giving a public performance of a song without paying for a license. Would that please people or not? They know they could do it, but they're not going to do it. So there's a lot of aspects of the business which is quite confusing for the general public. It's a pretty ruthless business.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Chapter 42 is titled Everybody's Doing It, Downloading. And you write in that chapter, quote, records were selling less and less, profits were down, and the major record companies blamed downloading. But that was rubbish. The problem was not the downloading itself. It was that record companies hadn't foreseen it, nor moved to be a part of it. What could record companies have done? What should have been done?
Well, record companies, first of all, nobody in the music industry who works at the top end of a record company is very bright, because what they get paid, however much they get paid, if they could do that without being employed by a corporation, they would make more money. So if you have an A&R man, yes, he's quite clever and he's been involved with a lot of hit acts, but that's because the hit acts walk through the door and want a deal. But if you knew outside of the corporation, if you knew what was a hit act or not, and you signed that hit act and did it yourself outside the corporation, you would make an awful lot more money. So the people at the top of corporations are usually reenacting situations and work as they have before. They're not very good at predicting the future, or looking into the future, or understanding what change should take place. Those are sharp people. Those are entrepreneurs. Those are the people who've always pushed the business forward. People who come along, and if you like, you could say they're gaming the system, but they're challenging the system. And so Napster challenged the system. And then the record companies unbelievably sold the rights to download songs to Apple. So Apple suddenly owned the music business. It was absurd. Every download was done by Apple, who paid the record companies a small amount. Suddenly record companies realized nobody was buying records anymore. They only downloaded them. And they hadn't foreseen it. They'd given it all away to Apple. So it was their fault. And it was rubbish to say the music business was suddenly collapsing. It was stronger than ever. But Apple were the people making the money. And the record corporations had to run and grab it back.
So how much does an artist get paid whenever I hit play on Spotify on a song? It's very minimal.
Oh, it's 0.003, but it's exactly the same as they always got paid when you bought a record.
Really?
You know, when a teenager fell in love with George Michael's new record. No, we've got to go back further now. Let's go back to the days of records, real records. Okay, so Elvis Presley had a hit record, you know, and Mary down the street, she rushed off and bought Elvis's record, and she lay on the floor next to the record player, and she listened to that record 100 times. Actually, she probably listened 500 times, because you can listen 100 times in 3 hours, just playing it and playing it and playing it. So she's listened to that record 100 times, and she paid, probably in those days, 30 cents for it or whatever it was. But if you were talking about today's prices for a single, let's say she paid $5 for it. She listened to it 100 times. The artist was probably paid a 4-6% royalty. So what the artist made on that royalty from that record was for 500 plays. It wasn't for one play. And artists get confused. They say, oh, I've had 500 plays and I've only got this much money. Well, that's how much you would have got for selling one record. And probably streaming pays more.
So that's how the math was done. That's how it was all worked out. With that in mind, it was.
Well, if you bought a record, you no longer had to pay to play it or hear it over and over and over and over again. If they sold a record that you're only allowed to listen 500 times, now today's music business would think like that. They'd find some digital way of stopping you listening 500 times. Click, turned off, pay again. Couldn't do that in those days. So you could play a record 1,000 times. If you got bored, you can give it to a friend and he can go and play it. So really, you're getting paid much better now with streaming. It's true, a lot of them don't make a lot from it, but that's not because streaming companies aren't paying it. It's because the record company intervenes and takes the biggest chunk of the money. But that's what they did with records as well. Yeah. If you were Michael Jackson, you got the best deal, you know, Sony, CBS had ever given, and you were getting 20 cents a record or something. That's what normally the record company got, and they gave the artist 2 cents. Same with streaming. And most artists are being, I'm going to use the word screwed, and record companies will object, but they're getting an unfairly small percentage of the total amount. That's why they're complaining. It's not because the streaming companies aren't paying it. Okay. And the record companies, as always, get an unfairly large amount.
Chapter 31. It's titled We Will Rock You, Stadium Tours and Managers. This gets into the debauchery of the bands who are packing stadiums by the late 70s, the drugs, the booze, the sex, destroying dressing rooms and hotels, but you also get into some of the tactics and the bullying of managers, like Peter Grant, who's probably the most legendary of them all with the stories. You write in this one, quote, the person who had the real power in all this was not the record company, but the manager. How did that come to be, and what were some of the things managers were doing?
In the 60s, until the 60s, record companies had no marketing departments because they were selling single records. And the record was the marketing. The song was the marketing. You didn't need how to market a song because the tune, the singer, the sound, that's what marketed it. And then as things switched and artists became more important and the songs became less important, you were marketing artists. And artists were difficult things. They weren't passive like songs or records. And record companies, to start with, tried to find someone within the company who could look after the artists and guide them and manage them. But they couldn't. And artists are complex and tricky. And they're best off being managed by somebody who's not part of the record company, because the record company is only looking after their interests as their own interests as a corporation. And so managers took over. So the 60s, the managers took over. And the most important people in the music business from 1965 on were the managers. Then when touring started in the 70s, the artists at last found how to get rich, because the record companies never, ever paid them enough. Even if they had massive hits, they didn't get enough royalties from the record companies to get rich. But when touring started, this was their money, not the record company's money. And so now managers, sharp people, some con men, some good, honest businessmen, moved in and took over and ran it for the artists and gotten the money they deserved from having those huge audiences. And they did run it. They ran the whole show. Peter Grant's a good example, but he's a particularly belligerent example and not always very nice. But nearly every major group who was touring had a manager who was, if you like, the general or the field marshal. And he'd have this huge army of people touring around. The road crews would be big, the stars would be the stars. And the man in charge was always the manager. And that was the best decade ever for the big managers.
Did that where I know cocaine was for fun and partying, but I would think cocaine was also to stay awake on these grueling tours because they're sleeping like 2-3 hours, maybe a clip here and there on the bus.
If you've ever been to a gig and enjoyed it, you leave that gig quite high. You don't go straight home to sleep. You want to go to dinner afterwards, have some friends and have a drink. That's watching the gig. That's not playing the gig. If you go there and you play that gig, I can tell you, you've been on such a massive high. The gig finishes at 11 p.m. It'll be 2 p.m., even with some drink and some dinner, before you even come near to being able to go to sleep. But during those 3 hours, people will have turned up with a bit of this and a bit of that. Cocaine is one of them. So 3 p.m. comes and you're so high you can't sleep. And so you take something else to help you go to sleep. So you've now been up, you're now coming down, all drugs. You get 2 hours, 3 hours sleep. The tour manager bangs on the door. You've got to be in the airport in 15 minutes, drags you out of bed. So a bit more cocaine to get you awake and down to the airport. And so it goes on day after day, and you end up with 2 or 3 hours sleep a night. The only way you're surviving and getting yourself up sufficiently to play the gig and get up in the morning and down sufficiently to go to sleep for a few hours is with drugs or alcohol. And that's what they all go through. A lot of them get very stuck on that. And the whole performance, the whole month or 2 months or 3 months of touring is such a high, continuous high in itself, that when you get back home afterwards, you don't want to live. There's nothing to live for. You can't go back to just being in the house. It's difficult to adjust from mayhem and madness and drugs and groupies and the audience screaming to a nice wife
solitude. Well, yeah, the solitude of a wife and kids, the white picket fence. Yeah. And then the other thing is too, the record companies would say, as soon as you're off the road, we got to get an album. So then they're in the studio.
Absolutely. It's not a nice life, and very few of them like it. And it's like it is taking drugs. It's like taking drugs. It involves taking drugs. Most drug addicts would say they'd rather not be a drug addicts. But, when their time comes around every day, which they normally take their drugs, they think they'll put it off another day. Well, with alcohol too, with most things, many a time I've tried to give up drink and it's not difficult. I got a headache. I'm not going to drink tonight. But, the day's a long time. You work hard and it comes to 9 o'clock and you really would like that just glass of wine. That won't hurt me. Except it turns into a bottle. I'll do it. I'll stop tomorrow. They do get caught up in this. And most of them say, look, I've got £1 million. I've got $1 million. I have $5 million in the bank now. I'd like to stop. But it's difficult. You've got the pressure of the public, the record company, the fans, the manager. Everything's turning on them. By now, the nice wife and kids are not in the suburban house. They're in some damn great villa somewhere, and you've got the other villa down in the south of France. Oh, the wife's divorced, and you've got to pay her, and you've got the new girlfriend, and the money pours in and pours out. And so you put it all off another year, and they go on and on and on. Most of them destroy themselves. And you've seen it. They're all those wonderful books on rock and roll madness.
That's a good segue to the title of the book, Black Vinyl, White Powder, the real story of the British music industry, the story of 5 decades of British pop. Although you say in the foreword, you hadn't set out to write something as grandiose as that. How did this project come to be?
Well, I wrote my first book in 1983, which hasn't come out in America. And then I didn't write another book until then, nearly 2000. And I in between that time, I managed Wham and done a lot of big things in the music business, and I sort of forgot that my plan was to be a writer, not to be a manager. And after I'd written my first book, I thought, that's it, now I'm going to be a writer. But it didn't go that way. And so eventually, one day, I didn't have anything to do. I was in between groups and projects, and I went to see a publisher and said, I think it's time I try to write a book. And he said, well, that's fantastic. Can we do a book about the whole history of the industry? And being British, he was thinking more British industries than American. So I said, yeah, that's nice. And I didn't see it as what it became. I saw it just as a nice book about the British music industry. I've been in it. I'd look at it a bit deeper and investigate it a bit more, put myself into it, tell stories about my own time management. And then the more I looked at it, I thought, well, the key to this whole thing, the British music industry, but the whole music industry, is drugs. Every time there's been a change in the industry and how it operates and shifts and the music changes, it goes from one style to another, there's always been a drug behind it. So I went right back to the beginning. I mean, I started this after the Second World War, so I started with rock. But rock music emerged from country blues, and it emerged from country blues because after the war, all the combated forces in the war, so both Japan and Germany, America, UK, France, Germany, all those governments manufactured vast amounts of amphetamine to give the troops. I mean, when you're told to get off a landing barge and run up the beach with a bayonet and a rifle and you're being machine gunned, you don't do that if you're sober. You're full of amphetamine. That's why you agree to do it. And amphetamine kept pilots awake, and it was in the cabin of every plane everywhere. It was the drug of the Second World War, created and distributed by the governments to the forces. And when the war finished, all those governments had millions and millions of tablets, and none of them wanted to waste them. So they did not make it illegal. And so those drugs were legally on sale until they ran out. 1949, 1950, amphetamine began to run out, and then the governments decided we won't make any more. We'll illegalize it, delegalize it. But in that time, American coach drivers, bus drivers, long distance truck drivers had discovered it. The way to drive from New York to LA without having to stop and therefore making a lot more money is to keep on taking amphetamine, which was Benzedrine. And tour bus drivers discovered it too. And so the tour bus drivers kept them awake when they were going from one venue to another with the band, and they passed it back. And so the band discovered it too. And the next thing you know, all those country blues were getting a little bit faster, a little bit harder, a little bit edgier. And slowly, rock and roll, or rhythm and blues and rock and roll, emerged from country blues because of the influence of Benzedrine. And then I continued to look at this, and then albums emerged from LSD. Marijuana was the drug at the beginning of the 60s and was around everywhere in America and UK. But really, when LSD came along, that was the moment when the industry switched from singles to albums, because when you took LSD, life drifted and was slow, and if you put on a single, you'd hardly had time to sit down again. The damn thing was finished. So you want an album. And that was the thing which pushed the album market. So record companies were very approving of LSD, and it caused the sale of albums to increase hugely. And then once that was established, there was a great surge in the availability in the UK, I'm not sure in America, of a new amphetamine, which was amphetamine sulfate, which is an amphetamine, the horrible thing, you sniffed up your nose, gave you a terrible running nose down your throat, tasted disgusting. And that was the push for glam rock and punk in the UK. And I think it was the same in America. I think amphetamine sulfate was the drive for punk in the 70s America. Next one was MDMA, which came along in the 90s and changed everyone to dance. In every single decade, you saw another drug coming along and affecting the music. The kids all took those drugs and went with the new music. Nowadays, they're sophisticated. Nowadays, you talk to kids, and they know all the drugs. They know all the different drugs. And you say, what drugs do you do? And they say, it depends where I'm going. So-and-so wants us to go to a disco on Monday. So off they go, they take the disco drug. And then, no, we're going to see a blues band. So you take a different drug. They're very knowing and knowledge about which drugs are the right thing. But until about 20 years ago, they all took the same one for a period of time and then moved on to another one. And the music changed with it. And that's why the title was Black Powder, White Powder.
People think of the Beatles starting the British pop explosion, but not the case, you say. It started as early as 1962.
It wasn't the first British explosion either, but that's another matter altogether. The Beatles, well, Herman's Hermits were the biggest British group in America, long before the Beatles were there. They paved the way. The Beatles was the British explosion, but Herman's Hermits had come over to America and really captured America, had several number ones, and opened the Americans' eyes to the fact that the UK might provide a good source of music and was worth looking at. And so probably without Herman's Hermits and one or two other bands, Dave Clark and Heritage, without them, the American industry wouldn't have been so primed to promote the Beatles when they came along. And the Beatles didn't break instantly in America. When the Beatles had big hits in England for a year before America took to them, they had to be persuaded. I mean, Capitol Records didn't even release them to start with. They wanted more Dave Clark and more Herman's Hermits. But, the invasion started with Dave Clark and Herman's Hermits, and it exploded when the Beatles came.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. I just spoke with an author who wrote a novel based on managing a rock and roll band in New York City in 1971 and having to deal with the Mafia. And that was all based on fact, things that he witnessed because he was a manager in New York. And you could speak to this too, because you were managing the Yardbirds when you went to the U.S. to set up a tour, and you found out that there were some challenges along the way. You had to be aware of the Mafia. Can you talk about that time, the time you came to the U.S. for that tour?
You had to be aware. I would say that there's a big advantage being British, because they didn't really know how to get to the British, and they weren't. There wasn't a British Mafia of the same type. There was British gangsters, but that was different. My method always of doing this is to be politely innocent. You wouldn't run away from them, because then they chase you like a dog. You stand and look it in the eye. And you must not quite let them know that you understand, so they think bloody these English guys are so stupid, they don't understand you. I'm telling this guy I'll kill him if he doesn't do this. He doesn't even understand, so they don't bother to kill you. Yeah, there was a lot of that. And just after the Yardbirds, I got into record production with a partner in England called Ray Singer. We were both pretty successful record producers. So I stopped managing, became a record producer. We came over to America to look for companies who wanted to commission us to make records. We went to RCA and ABC, and we got lots of commissions. And somebody said, you've got to go to see Roulette. They want some records, and they got plenty of money. And this nice guy called Maurice Levy, who runs Roulette, you'll like him. He's got a good sense of humor. And the guy who told us to do this had a good sense of humor, because Maurice Levy was the one outstanding Mafia run and control company in America. But we didn't know that. So we went off to see Maurice. He decided he liked us. These two English guys, nice, personal English guys. And so he called us back afterwards and said, I'm sending over one of my guys. He's going to have dinner with you tonight. And he wanted us to run Roulette in UK. He wanted us to. He'd had a guy before and he'd left, and he wanted us to take over and run the company in UK. But by then we knew, we'd learned that day when we went to see Maurice Levy, that it was a Mafia company. When we went to Roulette that day, we went to the counter downstairs, and there was a nice guy in a suit who said, oh yeah, you come to see Mr. Levy. Let me show you to the waiting room. We went up to the waiting room, and he showed us in, and we sat down, and after a minute, Ray said, I want to go and have a pee. I'll just go to the toilet. He went, and the door didn't have a handle on the inside. So this is strange. You don't often find yourself in a room without a handle on the door. And there was no bell, no way of contacting, so we had to sit in the room until the guy came back. So then he came back eventually, said, Mr. Levy, I'll see you now. And he showed us into Maurice Levy's office. Maurice Levy's office was quite long and narrow. And at one end was this desk on a dais. So it was raised about 2 feet above the floor level of the rest of the office. And Maurice sat behind that desk. But that's not where he was. He was down in front of the desk, holding in his hands, round the neck, a little black guy, a little fragile-looking black guy. And by the way, halfway up this long, narrow office was a white line across the carpet. And when we were shown in, the nice guy, young guy in the suit who'd showed us the waiting room first, said, you don't cross that line without Mr. Levy's permission. So anyway, we came in the office, we're told this, and there standing in the middle of the office is Maurice with his hands, this guy being held by the collar off the ground. And Ray, I didn't know this, and Ray whispered to me, fuck me, he said, that's Mickey Stevenson. the best black producer in America. He's Motown's #1 songwriter and producer. And Levy was shaking him. You fucking little cocksucker! You promised me a fucking hit, and you gave me a fucking flop. And he threw him on the floor.
Oh,
and this poor Mickey Stevenson crawled to the door and ran away.
Oh my God! It's like a scene out of The Goodfellas.
It was. It was just that. So then Morris Levy goes back to his desk and sits down and says, "Hey guys, okay, so what are you here for?" And we said, "Well, we thought we might like to produce some records for you." He said, "Yeah, that's what we want. We want hits. You're going to give us a hit, not like that fucking cocksucker guy."
Wow.
Right? Yeah, we'll give you a hit. You know what? How much do you want? You know. And so we just wanted to get out of there. We realized once this was what it was.
Wow.
And so then that evening, he sent this guy around to have dinner with us at the Algonquin where we were staying. And the guy said, "Mr. Levy's decided you're the guys to run the company in England. So you're going to be running our company in England." He didn't say, "Would you like to?" You're going to be running our company in England. Ray and I knew we had to get out of this. And so Ray had been an actor. He'd been a comedian, actually, on a show in England. Quite a good actor, quite a comedian. So he decided to act the fool, but very subtly, because it couldn't be acting the fool like a over-the-top thing. It had to be very subtle. So I got the hang of it, and we both just acted stupid. And the guy said, "So, we're going to say you go and find an office in England, And I said, "Where would we find an office?" They said, "Well, you just go and find and rent an office." "Oh, right. What rent? What's that? What's rent? Do we have to buy a property or something?" "No, you go and rent an office." "Oh, well, I've never done that before. But how does that work?" You had to talk like that until the guy got more and more exasperated and thought we were complete idiots. And presumably he went back and told Morris we were idiots and we weren't the people he should run the company. 2 months later, the guy who Morris Levy put in to run the company was found dead in the River Thames with a concrete block tied around his feet.
Holy shit.
So we were quite pleased with ourselves.
Wow. Yeah. I guess it's fortunate that you're here talking to me today, considering what could have happened. Oh man. Let's wind down with a book on Wham. I'm Coming to Take You to Lunch, a fantastic tale of boys, booze, and how Wham were sold to China. How did that whole idea come to be where you wanted them to perform in China? Because that was a big breakthrough moment for them.
Well, it was. I didn't want them to. It was just that I had a partner, Jazz Summers. We were managing them together. And when we first met them, we decided, we could have a dinner and sort out what we were going to do. And they hadn't quite decided if they were going to appoint us as managers or not. So we went to the Bombay Brasserie, a very good Indian restaurant in London, very grand, posh Indian restaurant. And so we sat there, and George said to us, "We want to be the biggest group in the world, and you've got 1 year." And I said, "It's impossible. The biggest group in the world has to be the biggest group in America, because America's 60% of the market, and no one's ever done it in a year. Even the Beatles took 2 years. It can't be done. There's no national press in America. There's no national television. Everyone runs at different times. The way people become big is you do a tour of 40 cities in small venue, and then go back in a medium venue, and go back in a bigger venue. Bit by bit, you build it up. It takes 2 to 3 years. No one's ever done it in a year." And George said, "Well, you do it in a year or you won't manage us." And then Jazz, I think we were onto our 3rd bottle or 4th bottle of wine now, said, "Why not we make you the first group ever to play in communist China, and then you'll be in the news all over the world. Maybe we can do it in a year." And George said, "Yeah, I like that. Do that." So 2 weeks later, I was off to China. Well, in those days, you couldn't get a visa for China unless you're on an official government position. You had to get an invitation from the Chinese government, and they were only given to businessmen. You could only travel in groups. They weren't given to individuals. And I said I was going to get Wham to China, so it's like a madness. But I flew off to Hong Kong, which I knew quite well. I had friends in Hong Kong, and a friend there sent me to see somebody up a little back alley, and if you paid him enough, he could put a visa on your passport, which would get you across the border. So I set off on the train to Guangzhou from Hong Kong with this visa on my passport. I was told which exit to go through, the guy to look out for, and sure enough, I found him. I gave him. He said, "Okay, come on in." And so there I was in China, didn't speak a word of Chinese, was not meant to be there by myself, was likely to be picked on at any minute. Why is a foreigner here, not in the group? And I was going to try to get Wham to be the first Western pop group ever to play in China. Who could possibly authorize that? Probably only the president of China. Well, the second or third most powerful man in the world, Deng Xiaoping, perhaps the president of America, comes first, Russia second, China third. And I'm in Guangzhou by myself. What am I even thinking about? How do I do this? And so from there, to get Wham to play in China, and it was indeed Deng Xiaoping, the president who gave permission, was quite a story. It took a year and a half, and they played in China. And 3 months after they played in China, we were doing a stadium tour of America. So it took 18 months to make them the biggest group in America, not a year. And George still grumbled. He said, I told you had a year. And I said, well, you've done it in 18 months. Well, he said, that's not what you promised.
Well, that's how I was going to finish with that question about how he was during that period. And then, of course, after, when he goes solo, he's a huge pop star. And what was your experience like with him during those days? And how did you find him afterwards? Because you you ran into him years later. And
yeah, and the point is, I stopped managing at the end of Wham because I knew he was gay and he knew he was gay. And Wham was a huge pressure on him because it's a very heterosexual image, the two, Starsky and Hutch, Butch Cassidy, Sundown Kid, the two Hollywood, bromance guys.
Andrew Ridgeley, we should mention.
Yeah, well, whatever they do during the film, at the end of it, they ride off into the sunset together, throw away the girlfriends and they're still mates too. And that was the image of Wham. And it was very difficult for him to consider coming out as gay during that. But I knew he wanted to and couldn't face the pressure. And the whole point of breaking Wham up and going solo was he's going to start again and be himself. And then, of course, he didn't. More pressure from the record company, from his own ambition. So he created an even more heterosexual image. When Faith took the Wham image and turned it, far from going gay, he projected this big rock and roll tough guy image and found himself getting into more and more trouble, mental trouble with his own self, more lonely, more cut off, didn't even have Andrew Ridgeley now as a friend to travel with and to perform with, and found it getting more and more difficult to survive mentally, which is why at the end of that tour, he did what he did, which was to decide he wasn't going to make any more videos and wasn't going to go along with what the record company asked. But by then he had $50 million in the bank and he'd had 5 number ones in America. 5 number ones from one album is almost unprecedented. It might be unprecedented. It might be the only one ever. So he'd become a massive star, but he didn't want to go on being a massive star. And we talked earlier about the way groups often want to stop being groups and just, that's enough. And they can't. But he did. And he just told the record company, I'm not going to do this. And had a huge falling out with CBS as a result, which he never really recovered from with them, and went his own way. Now, what was very strange is he then became a bigger star in England because Faith was not huge in England. It was the biggest album ever in America. And in England, we all knew who George was because we all loved Wham. But Faith itself wasn't such a big album in England. But we liked people who put 2 fingers up at the industry. We always liked the guy who's sort of the David and Goliath thing. And so once he started doing that, he was very appealing to the English market. And so all his music after Faith became bigger in England than America, which is the reverse of Faith.
Yeah, he must have envied you because you had come out, and there was a great story. Your dad was just so great about the joke he made when you said, "Yeah, Dad, I'm gay," and you wondered what they're going to say, and your dad was just hilarious with. I can't recall what was the thing. What was his?
I like anyone gay. I knew I had to tell my parents, and for 2 whole years, I used to go to lunch with my parents this is when I was 23 or 24. Every Sunday lunch, I went to lunch with my parents. And every week I planned, I've got to tell, at least my dad, I've got to tell him I'm gay. And every week the lunch slipped by and the opportunities weren't there. And 2 years, that's 24 times I failed or something. And one day the moment came, I was there sitting with, I just had to tell him, I said, Dad, I've got to tell you I'm gay. Homosexual, all right, guys, not girls. And he was really shocked. He just sat back in amazement and said, are you sure? And I got really angry. I said, of course I'm fucking sure. I've spent 2 years trying to tell you, I'm sure I'm gay. And he took a breath and he said, Well, he said, that's good. He said, I was afraid you were turning out a bit boring.
Oh, what? That must have made you feel so good, though, right?
Yeah, and the next day,
because
he
you probably were
bought
worried,
cigars.
like, what is he going to do? Is he going
The
to?
next day, he bought cigars and he took them to the office and gave them to everybody. He said, hey, I'm celebrating. I've got a gay son. I've got a straight son. I've got a gay son. I've got a daughter. What a pity I didn't have another daughter. She could have been a lesbian. I had the clean sweep.
That's a great story. Well,
and it's great confidence giver. I mean,
Sure.
it really made me feel good about it.
all of these stories are in these books. It's where to begin. I mean, people could just look for them on Amazon. I'm Coming to Take You to Lunch, A Fantastic Tale of Boys, Booze, and How Wham were sold to China. Black Vinyl, White Powder, The Real Story of the British Music Industry. And The Business, A History of Popular Music from Sheet Music to Streaming. But also we have Sour Mouth, Sweet Bottom, Lessons from Dissolute Life from 2022. And you can find them on Amazon, but we should also mention you have a website. What's your website address?
Just SimonNapierBell.com. Simon Napier-Bell, one word.
Simon, this was outstanding. So many great stories. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me about all of these great stories. What a career.
It's not over.
It ain't over yet. It ain't over yet. Yeah, I see you're very busy. I mean, you got a lot of fun.
I've got 2 new films, a new book, and I've got a big music project on the end too.
That's great. Thanks, Simon.
Lovely. Really enjoyed talking to you. You're a nice guy to talk to.
That's it. It's in the books.